Slack. He looked at the window and then at Lily, and his face did something she had never seen a face do before. It simply collapsed, all the years of certainty falling away at once. An FBI agent helped Lily to her feet as the clock moved toward midnight. Special Agent Hayes confirmed it. The servers had been seized, the trafficking operation was exposed, the murder case against her mother had been formally reopened. Richard and Beatrice were handcuffed and removed, one of them screaming, one of them silent. At midnight, the estate legally became hers. 6 months later, Lily made her decisions. She kept enough to secure her future and to do what she had actually come there to do. The rest went to orphanages and youth programs, a number that would have been incomprehensible to her a year earlier, given without hesitation, because she understood exactly what that kind of resource meant to the children on the receiving end. Pendleton Manor itself she converted into a shelter for women fleeing violence. The dark stone walls, the towers, the oppressive weight of all that family history, redirected. Given a different purpose. Not erased, but transformed. On the wall near the entrance, she had a small plaque installed. Her mother's name. A woman who had been 22 years old when she found something she shouldn't have found, and had told the truth anyway, at a cost that Lily only fully understood now. Lily was no longer defined by the blank space where her history used to be. She had her mother's story. She had the truth. She had chosen what to do with both. Here's what I keep thinking about when I sit with this story. Beatrice and Richard drove 3 luxury SUVs to a children's home in Maine with a $50,000 check and a pen, absolutely certain they understood what they were dealing with. An orphan. Someone with no resources, no connections, no idea what she was actually worth. Someone who would be grateful for the offer. They had cataloged everything about her situation. They had missed everything about her character. The one thing they never accounted for was what 22 years of that orphanage had actually built inside her, the ability to see clearly under pressure, to ask the right question at the right moment, to recognize hunger disguised as generosity. To say no when no was the only word that made sense. They came to buy her silence. She gave them a sentence instead. Whatever you've been handed in your life, whatever blank spaces, whatever missing pieces, whatever rooms people assumed you'd never have the courage to enter, I want you to hear this. The people who try to tell you what you're worth based on where you came from are almost always wrong. And the moment they need you to sign something, that's usually the moment you should ask why. Drop in the comments what you would have done with the 85 million. I genuinely want to know, because this one is going to split the room in all kinds of interesting directions. Subscribe if you haven't. There are more stories exactly like this one coming, and you do not want to miss what's next. See you in the next one. 3 women connected by scent and memory and a pendant that carried more weight than any of them had ever said out loud. Dolores opened her eyes one final time. They were clear and focused, like she had been saving her last bit of strength for this exact moment. She looked at Nicole and whispered, "The pendant, baby. Keep it close. Mr. Avery will explain everything." Then she closed her eyes. And the room got very, very still. Nicole organized the funeral herself. Made every phone call, signed every check. White canopy. 40 folding chairs. A single bouquet of white lilies on the casket. A small cemetery on the outskirts of Atlanta called Rest View, tucked behind a row of Georgia pines, quiet and without fanfare, exactly how Dolores would have wanted it. 1 hour before the service, Nicole was alone in her mother's kitchen going through a stack of old papers and unopened mail when her phone rang. Number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. Something made her answer. The man identified himself as Howard Avery, attorney at law, executor of the estate of Dolores and Kessler. He'd been Dolores's legal representative for over 20 years. He needed to speak with Nicole urgently about her inheritance. Nicole almost laughed out loud. Her mother lived in a clapboard house with a leaky porch roof. Drove a 12-year-old sedan. Wore the same 3 dresses in rotation. Considered name-brand tea bags a splurge. But Howard Avery wasn't joking. And what he told her made Nicole set the phone on the kitchen counter and stare at the wall for 3 full minutes without blinking. Her grandmother, a woman named Estelle Kessler, had been one of the original silent investors in a mining venture launched in the early 1960s. This was an era when Black Americans were locked out of every boardroom, every bank, every investment table in the country. Estelle had found a way in through a blind trust structure that kept her name off the public filings entirely. She had invested the equivalent of roughly $40,000 at the time, a staggering sum, money she had saved working 3 jobs for 2 decades. Over 60 years, that stake had quietly compounded into the controlling interest of what was now called Kessler Global Mining, a mineral and rare earth extraction conglomerate operating across 3 continents. Valued that morning at just over $65 billion. Dolores had inherited everything when Estelle passed. She never touched a single share. She never moved a single dollar. She lived as a housekeeper by choice, not because she didn't know what she had, but because she understood something most people never learn. She didn't trust wealth to protect her daughter. She trusted character. She wanted Nicole to build her spine in the real world, not behind the walls of a fortune she hadn't earned. And she wanted to see, really see, who would stand beside Nicole when they believed there was nothing to gain. Now everything belonged to Nicole. Every share, every asset, every account, every seat at every table. A fortune built across 3 generations of Black women who never needed the world to see them in order to know exactly who they were. Nicole went to the funeral. She wore a simple black dress. No jewelry, except one piece, the pendant her mother had lifted from her own neck the night before she died and placed around Nicole's with trembling fingers. She stood at the front of the grave with her hands folded, her back straight, her heart in pieces. Gregory arrived 20 minutes late in a black SUV with tinted windows. Tailored suit, sunglasses even under the overcast sky. His cologne reached the canopy before he did. He wasn't alone. On his arm was a woman named Sherry, tall, poised, wearing cream to a funeral not out of ignorance but out of intention. Everything about her entrance said, "I belong here more than you do." Gregory didn't sit beside Nicole. Didn't touch her shoulder. Didn't nod in her direction. He walked to the opposite side of the open grave and stood with Sherry, whispering something in her ear during the pastor's opening prayer. She smiled. He chuckled softly. At a funeral. Over his wife's mother's open grave. Vivian sat 3 rows back, legs crossed, chin lifted, watching everything with the expression of someone evaluating a restaurant she might not return to. Pamela scrolled through her phone during the eulogy, face flat with boredom. Nobody from Gregory's side said a word to Nicole. Not a hug, not a glance, not a single nod across the casket. The cemetery workers began lowering the casket. The ropes creaked under the weight. Nicole stood at the edge, her fingers wrapped around the pendant, her lips trembling, eyes dry. She had cried everything out the night before, alone on her mother's kitchen floor, sobbing until she couldn't breathe. All she had left now was a kind of stillness, not peace. Something like the space between lightning and thunder. Then Gregory moved. He walked around the grave slowly, deliberately, each step measured like a man comfortable being watched. His shadow fell across Nicole before he did. He stopped in front of her, looked down at the pendant at her throat, and without saying a single word, grabbed it. He yanked so hard the clasp snapped. The thin gold chain whipped against the back of her neck. A thin line of blood appeared along her collarbone. Nicole gasped, not from pain. From the sheer disbelief that this man she had given 15 years to, would do this here. Over her mother's open grave. Gregory held the pendant up in the light for a moment, turned his back on his wife, walked 3 steps to Sherry, and clasped it around her neck. Right there, with Dolores's body still being lowered into the earth below them. Sherry smiled. She touched it with her fingertips. Adjusted it against her collarbone. Then she looked at Nicole, and the look wasn't cruel exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was dismissive. It said, "This is mine now. And so is he." Vivian watched and said nothing. Pamela tilted her head and smirked like she was watching a scene in a movie she'd already predicted. Nicole touched the blood on her collarbone with 2 fingers. She looked at Gregory, at Sherry, at Vivian and Pamela, at every single person standing around that grave who had just watched a man desecrate his wife's grief in broad daylight. And she smiled. Not a broken smile. Not a defeated smile. Not the smile of a woman holding herself together. A knowing smile. The kind that says, you have absolutely no idea what's coming. Because 1 hour ago, in her mother's kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear, she had become the majority shareholder of a $65 billion company. And not a single person at this funeral had any idea. She wiped the blood from her neck with her thumb, watched Gregory kiss Sherry's forehead over her mother's grave, turned, walked to her car alone, and drove away without looking back. She knew something they didn't, and the kind of knowledge she carried didn't need a megaphone. For days later, Gregory called. Not to check whether she'd eaten. Not to ask how she was holding up. He called to deliver instructions, his voice flat and bored, like he was reading from a to-do list before bed. He needed her back in Atlanta to sign some papers. He was restructuring things. Making changes. Honestly, he said, I think it's time we talked about the future. Nicole asked what he meant. Your mama's gone, Gregory said. You got nothing now. No family, no money, no purpose. Just sign the papers and go quietly. Make it easy on both of us. That sentence landed like a fist through glass. Not because it was loud. Because it was calm. Because he believed it. Every single word. He believed she was nothing. And for a moment, sitting in that dark kitchen, exhausted and hollow, she almost believed it too. Almost. She sat in the dark for a long time after he hung up. The clock ticked. A dog barked somewhere down the road. Then she picked up her phone, scrolled to a number she had saved 3 days before the funeral and never dialed. Howard Avery. Attorney at law. His office was on the 12th floor in downtown Charleston, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the harbor. He was a tall man in his 60s with silver temples and the measured voice of someone who had been keeping a very important secret for a very long time. He laid it all out. Nicole sat with her hands folded and listened as he explained what her grandmother had built, what her mother had protected, what was now entirely hers, the shares, the accounts, the trust documents, the board resolutions, Nicole's name on every single page. Howard slid the folder across the desk. Your mother spent 40 years protecting this, he said quietly. What you do with it now is yours to decide. Nicole sat still for a long time. She didn't gasp. She didn't flip through the pages in disbelief. She just looked at her mother's signature at the bottom of the last document. That careful, steady script. The same handwriting that signed every permission slip for every school field trip. The same handwriting on every birthday card Nicole had ever received. Then she asked one question. The pendant Gregory took. Does it matter legally? Howard shook his head. The pendant was sentimental. The real power was in the documents, the shares, the board seat. Nicole nodded slowly. But something moved behind her eyes, something older than anger. That pendant wasn't just gold. It was her mother's heartbeat. Her grandmother's faith. The quiet pulse of 3 generations of women who had chosen silence over spectacle and built something the world couldn't see. And right now it was hanging around the neck of a woman who wore it to brunch like a party favor. Nicole stood up. Shook Howard's hand. And when she walked out of that office, she walked differently. Not faster. Not louder. Just certain. Like a woman who finally understood the full weight of what she'd been carrying her whole life. She moved like water for the next 3 weeks. No confrontations. No cryptic social media posts. No calls returned to Vivian, who had suddenly remembered how to be warm and concerned. No responses to Pamela's awkward friendly texts after months of cruelty. Nicole moved quietly, with purpose and without performance, with direction and without drama. She met with Howard twice more. She asked questions about board governance and voting rights and fiduciary structures that made the lawyers sit up straighter in their chairs. She was not just inheriting money. She was learning to lead. She took her seat on the board of Kessler Global Mining in a private session that made no headlines. She bought a new dress, black, simple, cut clean at the shoulders. She got her hair done, pulled back smooth, the way Dolores used to wear hers before church. She stood in front of the mirror in her mother's bedroom and for a moment didn't see herself. She saw her mother. The same jawline. The same steady eyes. The same quiet fire. Then she waited. Gregory's annual investors' gala was coming. His biggest event of the year, a rented ballroom at a hotel in Buckhead, 300 guests, developers and bankers and politicians who smelled like ambition and expensive cologne. Gregory had been chasing a deal with a development group called Monarch Partners for months. This gala was his audition. His moment. The night he believed would change everything. Nicole wasn't on the guest list. She didn't need to be. She had a phone call from Warren, the lead developer at Monarch, who had learned through board channels exactly who Nicole Kessler-Taylor was, and who wanted her there. The night of the gala, Gregory moved through the room like he owned it. Dark suit, gold cufflinks, champagne in his right hand, a firm handshake waiting in his left. Vivian trailed him in a sequin jacket, telling anyone who would listen that her son was about to change the Atlanta skyline. Sherry stood beside him in a fitted black gown, the pendant at her chest, wearing it like she'd earned it, like it had always been hers, like Dolores had never existed. Then the ballroom doors opened. Nicole walked in alone. No entourage. No announcement. No dramatic entrance. Just a woman in a black dress walking through a set of double doors like she had every right to be there. Because she did. She didn't rush. She didn't scan the room. She moved through the crowd the way water moves through stone, calm, quiet, and completely unstoppable. Heads turned. Then more heads. Then the whole room began to shift in her direction, the way a room shifts when something changes about the gravity. There was something about her that people couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Not confidence exactly. Certainty. The certainty of a woman who knows something the room hasn't figured out yet. Gregory spotted her from across the ballroom and laughed. Leaned into Sherry and whispered, "She actually showed up. Watch this." He walked toward Nicole with his chest out, pitching his voice just loud enough for the nearest tables. "Nicole, this is a private event. You're embarrassing yourself." Nicole looked at him. The way you look at a child who doesn't understand what he's holding. "Actually," she said quietly but clearly, "I was invited by the developer you've been trying to impress all night." Gregory blinked. His smile froze. Warren stepped forward from the crowd, extended his hand, shook Nicole's warmly. "Ms. Kessler-Taylor," he said, "thank you for coming. The board's interest in the downtown corridor project means a great deal to us." The ballroom went silent. The kind of silence that starts at one table and spreads like cold air across every conversation in the room. Gregory's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked at Warren. He looked at Nicole. He looked at the faces around him, faces that had been hanging on his every word all night, now turned toward his wife with a recognition he had never received himself. Nicole didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She spoke the way Dolores spoke, low and steady and impossible to ignore. Like a woman who had rehearsed nothing, because the truth doesn't need practice. She told the room, not to humiliate, not to perform, but because 15 years of silence had to end somewhere, that she was the majority shareholder and newly seated board member of Kessler Global Mining. That her mother, the woman Gregory had called, that old woman, the woman he couldn't be bothered to visit while she was dying, had spent her entire life protecting a legacy worth more than every deal and every handshake in that room combined. That her grandmother before that had built something from nothing in an era that tried to make black women invisible and had succeeded anyway. And that the pendant Gregory ripped from her neck over her mother's open grave and clasped around his mistress's throat was not a trinket. It was a generational covenant, passed from grandmother to mother to daughter. A symbol of women who chose dignity over volume and let the world underestimate them on purpose. Then she turned to Sherry. The room held its breath. Nicole didn't shout, didn't point, didn't lean forward. She looked at Sherry with something that wasn't anger, it was closer to pity. And she said, simply and quietly, "You can keep the necklace." It was never about the gold. It was about what it represented. And clearly, that's something you'll never understand. Sherry's hand went to the pendant. Her fingers closed around it tight, like she was afraid someone was about to snatch it off her, the way Gregory had snatched it off Nicole. But Nicole wasn't reaching. She had already turned away. She looked at Gregory one last time. The man who told her she was nothing. Who humiliated her over her mother's open grave. Who spent 15 years treating her like a placeholder for the life he thought he deserved. My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce, she said. And Gregory, the house. It was paid off years ago through an account you never knew existed. It's mine. It always was. Gregory's face didn't fall slowly. It collapsed all at once, like a building with its foundation pulled out from underneath. Nicole turned and walked toward the exit. Warren fell into step beside her. 2 Monarch executives followed. Then 3 more guests. The room began to empty around Gregory like water draining from a cracked tub. He stood in the center of that ballroom with Sherry on his right and Vivian on his left. For the first time in his life, nobody was looking at him. What came next didn't arrive with fireworks. Warren's calls went straight to voicemail the next morning. By evening, Gregory was being escorted out of Monarch's lobby by security. Investors who had been friendly for years suddenly wanted reassurances. Contracts that felt solid needed revisiting. Meetings were scheduled and then simply not attended. No explanation, no apology, just empty chairs. Within 4 months, foreclosure notices sat unopened on his kitchen counter. Sherry lasted 11 days after the gala. He came home to find her packing. When he insisted it was temporary, that he'd fix it, she finally looked at him directly. I didn't come here for temporary, she said. I came here for what you had. The pause. You were useful. Now you're not. She picked up her bag, paused at the dresser, and set something down on the surface before she walked out. The pendant. Gregory stood there staring at it. Slowly, for the first time, not when he tore it off Nicole's neck, not when he clasped it around Sherry, he opened the locket. Inside was a tiny photograph. Dolores, holding baby Nicole. Both of them smiling at someone behind the camera. Morning light coming through a kitchen window. That same kitchen. That same house in Sumter. And on the inside face of the locket, engraved in script so small he had to squint. For my Nicole. Everything I am is yours. Gregory ran his thumb across Dolores's face. He closed the locket gently, like it might break if he held it too hard. And for the first time, maybe the only genuinely honest moment he'd had in years, he understood exactly what he had destroyed. Not a marriage. Not an inheritance. Not a business connection. A love so deep and so patient it had been pressed into gold and passed from hand to hand across 3 generations of women who never needed the world to see them shine. He sat in that empty apartment for a very long time. Nicole went home to South Carolina. She sat on her mother's porch in the old rocking chair, the one with the worn armrests and the creak on the left side that Dolores never fixed because she said it sounded like music. The pendant was back around her neck. She touched it sometimes without thinking, the way her mother used to, absent-mindedly, just checking that something precious was still there. She established the Dolores Kessler Foundation, scholarships for girls from small towns who were smart and quiet and overlooked. Girls who read books by flashlight on porches like this one. Girls who reminded Nicole of herself at 14, full of dreams she didn't have words for yet. She funded community centers. Invested in small businesses run by women who'd been told they weren't enough. She did all of it quietly, out of sight, the way her mother would have wanted. The way Estelle had started it 60 years earlier, invisible to the world, but essential to everything that grew from it. One evening, as the sun dropped below the tree line and the crickets began their nightly chorus, Nicole sat in the rocking chair and opened the locket. She looked at the photograph inside. Her mother's face. Her own baby face. That kitchen window light. She whispered, I understand now, Mama. And the breeze moved through the porch like a hand across her cheek. But unmistakable. Dolores didn't hide her wealth because she was afraid of it. She hid it because she wanted to see who would love her daughter when there was nothing to gain. She wanted to know who would stand beside Nicole when there was no fortune to leverage, no name to borrow, no power to impress. She chose the oldest test there is, the test of being seen as nothing. And the answer broke her heart. But it set Nicole free. Because sometimes the richest woman in the room is the one nobody notices. Sometimes the strongest person at the table is the one who hasn't spoken yet. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a world that wants you to shout is to stay quiet long enough to let the truth speak for you. Nicole never chased revenge. She didn't need to. She stood still and let the truth fall where it belonged. And when it was over, when the noise faded, when the betrayals scattered, when the ballroom emptied, she was still there. Still wearing the pendant. Still her mother's daughter. Still her grandmother's legacy. And that was more than enough. If this story stayed with you, you already understand something most people learn too late. Not everyone who stands beside you is actually there for you. And not everyone who loses you understands what they've lost, not until long after it's too late to do anything about it. Drop in the comments and tell me, what's the one thing in your life that someone underestimated and turned out to be worth everything? I read every single one of those answers. Subscribe if you haven't. More stories like this one are coming. And you'll want to be there when they do. See you in the next one.